Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika lahu wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluh. Amma ba'du fa'uzu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. قال الله تعالى في القرآن الحكيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إنا نحن نزلنا الذكر وإنا له لحافظون صدق الله العظيم. That verse of the Holy Quran which I have recited translates as follows: Surely we have revealed the reminder, we, that is Allah, and the reminder is the Holy Quran. Surely we have revealed the reminder, and surely we are its guardian. That is chapter 15, verse 9. And again, Innahu la Quranul Kareem fi kitabim maknoon la yamassuhu illal mutahharun. And that translates as follows: Surely this is a bountiful Quran, or you could say noble or honorable Quran, in a book which is protected, which no one touches except the purified ones. And this is chapter 56, verses 77 to 79. And finally, وَإِنَّهُ لَكِتَابٌ عَزِيزٌ لَا يَأْتِيهِ الْبَاطِلُ مِنْ بَيْنِ يَدَيْهِ وَمِنْ خَلْفِهِ تَنْزِيلٌ مِنْ حَكِيمٍ حَمِيدٍ. And that translates as this: and surely it is in an invincible book. The Holy Quran is in an invincible. The Holy Quran is an invincible book. Falsehood cannot come at it from before it or behind it, and it is a revelation from the wise, the praised one. And that is chapter 41, verses 41 and 42. The topic of this khutbah is: has anyone altered the Quran? And my reason for speaking on this topic is that allegations have been made recently by certain extremist anti-Ahmadiyya groups and campaigners that the Holy Qurans published by Ahmadiyya organizations contain alterations, or what is called tahrif in Arabic. They haven't made it clear what these so-called alterations are, but these slogans, such as Ahmadis have altered the Quran, are a cheap and nasty way of inciting the innocent Muslim public. So I have recited verses of the Quran in which Allah has promised that He Himself will guard the Quran from being corrupted or tainted by any human being. The first verse tells us that since Allah Himself has revealed the Quran, therefore He is also its guardian. And the second verse mentions the Quran as being in a protected book, and it says that only the purified can touch it. And this not only means that a person should be in a state of physical purity when handling the Quran, but it also means that that person can only understand and appreciate the teachings of the Quran if he approaches it with a pure mind and heart. And then the finer points of the Holy Quran are unfolded into the hearts of those who have purified their souls through worship and doing of good deeds. In the third verse, the Holy Quran is described as invincible. something which resists all attacks. And other translators have translated this word as unassailable and unconquerable. And that verse which I mentioned goes on to say that falsehood cannot come at it from before or behind. And this means that falsehood could not have entered into the Holy Quran at the time when it was being revealed. That is what is meant by before it. Falsehood cannot come at it from before it. And also, falsehood cannot enter into it later on at any time in history. Neither at the time when the Holy Quran was being compiled in book form, nor at any time later on. And this is what is meant by behind it. Falsehood cannot come at it, neither from before it, nor from behind it. So given all these verses of the Holy Quran, Allah does not need any protesters on the streets who use threats of violence in order to safeguard the Quran in its original form. Now, the question of altering the Arabic text of the Holy Quran doesn't arise because that text is obtained by Ahmadiyya publishers from standard Muslim sources from which other Muslims also obtain it, which used to be calligraphy in the old days and keyed in text these days. And it is very easy to check that the Arabic text in our Quran publications is exactly the same as that Arabic text in general Muslim publications. It might be that the allegations of these protesters are directed at Ahmadiyya translations, and they might mean that our translations into English and Urdu have altered the true meanings of the Quran. But I would like to point out that our critics themselves accept several different English and Urdu translations of the Quran. And those translations are different. If you take just the verse, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, then there are at least 8 different translations of this verse in the various English translations done by Muslims. And I'm not including Ahmadis here, done by Muslims such as Mr. Picathall, Muhammad Asad, Abdullah Yusuf Ali, etc. And for example, one says, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim is the most gracious, the dispenser of grace. Another says, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim is Lord of mercy and giver of mercy, etc. Each of these translators had seen the translations done before his time, his or her time, because one of them is actually a woman. And they decided to make changes in it. So which is the unaltered Quran out of these translations, and which are the altered ones? Now people will say that all these different translations are actually expressing the same meanings, but only using different words. In case of Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. And this is a fair point. As such, this is a fair point. But I will now look at what these translators themselves have said about why they made changes to produce their new translations. And first of all, I'll refer you to the well-known and well-respected English translation and commentary of the Holy Quran by Muhammad Asad, published around 1981. And Mr. Asad writes in it that all previous translators before me, before Mr. Asad, had learned Arabic only from books and they had never lived with the Bedouins of Arabia. And he says the Bedouins of Arabia still speak the Arabic idiom close to how it was in the Holy Prophet's time. And he then tells us that he himself learned Arabic by staying with them in Arabia. And therefore he can do proper justice to translating the Holy Quran. And his opinion expressed in his preface is that previous translators, despite being great scholars, he says they missed seeing the inner meaning of the Arabic of the Quran. And he says that their translations deviate very far from the spirit of the Holy Quran. And he says that their translations are, and I quote him here, distant and faulty echoes of the meaning and spirit of the Quran. I'm not here discussing whether Muhammad Asad was right or wrong about previous translators and their knowledge of Arabic. What I'm pointing out is that translators who are accepted by the general Muslim public, like Muhammad Asad, for example, and others, they have regarded the translators before them, the previous translators, who are also accepted by the general Muslim public, they have regarded them as having produced faulty translations. And they changed the earlier translations in significant ways. So if the later translations are right, if the later translators are right, then the earlier ones produced translations not correctly reflecting the Holy Quran. And if the earlier ones are right, then the later ones have altered the Quran from its right state to a wrong state. Now let me refer to another English translation of the Holy Quran with commentary, which was published around 1984 in Saudi Arabia by the approval of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And it is a revised version of an earlier very well-known translation and commentary by Abdullah Yusuf Ali, which is extremely well-known. And in this Saudi publication, they have a preface from the editors. And it says this, it says that previous translators of the Holy Quran, and this Saudi translation appeared in 1984. It says previous translators into English, it says about them, their works were private attempts, private individual attempts, greatly influenced by their own prejudices. So the preface tells us that the King of Saudi Arabia in 1979 issued a royal decree to produce a revised and corrected translation. And then the preface says that they selected an existing translation and they selected Abdullah Yusuf Ali's with the objective of revising its contents and correcting any faults in view of the objections raised against it. So they selected Abdullah Yusuf Ali's translation and then amended it, as they say. Now, the opinion of the publishers of this official Saudi translation of the Holy Quran into English is that all previous English translations were defective and faulty. And they say that Abdullah Yusuf Ali's was the least defective. And they have now corrected it, they say, corrected his translation. So for 50 years before this Saudi translation appeared, for 50 years, millions of Muslims had been reading those earlier English translations and treating them as authentic, done by Orthodox Muslims, such as by Muhammad Picathol, by Abdullah Yusuf Ali. They had been reading them for 50 years. And then in the 1980s, the Saudi committee comes along and it says, we have produced a translation correcting their errors. So the question we pose is this: which is the unaltered Quran as regards translation? Which is the unaltered Quran and which is the altered Quran? The ones before or the ones which corrected them? There's a biography of Abdullah Yusuf Ali written by a renowned Pakistani historian and author, now deceased. His name is Professor K.K. Aziz. He's no relation of mine, Professor K.K. Aziz. And in that biography of Yusuf Ali, life story of Yusuf Ali, Professor K.K. Aziz gives details of how after Yusuf Ali's death, his translation and commentary were changed by other publishers at various times at their own whim and according to their own opinion, and still published under the name of Yusuf Ali's translation and commentary. And Professor Aziz calls this, and I'm quoting him here, he calls it unconcealed tampering with his translation and commentary of the Quran. And as regards the Saudi edition, which I've just been mentioning, Professor K.K. Aziz is so outraged by the liberty taken by those publishers, he's so outraged that in his book, in his biography of Abdullah Yusuf Ali, Professor K.K. Aziz has reproduced the whole of the preface of that Saudi publication to show what they were trying to do. And at the end, Professor K.K. Aziz reaches this conclusion, and I quote him here. He says, "Here ends a valuable expose of Saudi tampering amounting to vandalism and intellectual dishonesty." And so what we read today as the work of Abdullah Yusuf Ali, in any edition published after his death, in any edition published after his 1938 edition, what we read is actually an altered and tampered with version of his original work. And the alterations they have made, these are not merely verbal changes that someone found more appropriate words to express the same thing. They don't only relate to that. Parts of his commentary were removed because the publishers disagreed with his interpretations. And this is the most widely accepted English translation and commentary of the Holy Quran in the Muslim world. So, yet you will find that our opponents, the opponents of the Ahmadiyya movement, who are so concerned and perturbed that Ahmadis have altered the Quran, they're not at all bothered that their own recognized translators of recent times have tampered with and dishonestly altered the translations of their own scholars done earlier. All of these scholars, Abdullah Yusuf Ali and those who amended his translation, they're all recognized in the Muslim world as proper translators. So what I would like to say in conclusion is that as Muslims, let us not accuse one another of altering the Quran, because it is protected against alteration by Allah Himself. And so what kind of image are we portraying in front of the world if some Muslim groups accuse others of altering the Quran when Allah has promised that it can't be altered by any human being. So that is as regards the text of the Holy Quran. And if we disagree with the translator's opinion or interpretation, we shouldn't accuse them of altering the Quran. We should merely say that they gave a wrong interpretation. According to us, they gave a wrong interpretation or wrong meaning. And we should not throw around inflammatory allegations against them of altering the Quran. Because, as I've said, such an allegation will inflame the masses and lead to violence of all kinds. So, may Allah enable us, all of us Muslims, to be temperate and civil with each other in this regard. Ameen. Barakallahu lana wa lakum fil Qur'anil Azim wa nafa'na wa iyyakum bil ayati wa zikril hakim. Innahu ta'ala jawadun karimun malikun barurufur rahim.